So good evening to all of you here in Washington, D.C., and greetings to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm Chris Chivvis, and I direct the American Statecraft program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'm delighted to open this special event featuring White House Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, Daleep Singh. I'll note this is one of three fantastic events that we have going on here this week in the American Statecraft program at Carnegie. On Tuesday, we were delighted to welcome the White House Homeland Security Advisor, Liz Sherwood-Randall, for a discussion of the Biden administration's migration policy. And tomorrow, we're going to have a really, I think, fascinating discussion as part of our Pivotal States program on alternative approaches to North Korea. Now, as all of you know, today's event focuses on the role of allies in industrial policy. Globally and in the United States, we've seen significant increase in recourse to industrial policy, especially but not uniquely for national security objectives. And one of the big challenges in developing industrial policies that further our security has been how we coordinate them so that they create synergies with allies instead of frictions, so that they reap the benefits of allies, specialized technologies, expertise, and so forth, rather than throw up obstacles to collaboration. So it's my pleasure, therefore, to have Daleep Singh here with us for this conversation with Peter Harrell. Daleep serves as the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics in the Biden-Harris administration. This is a position that he's held since February of 2024, but this is his second time in the role, having served from day one of the Biden administration through June of 2022. In the interim, he worked as the Chief Global Economist for PGIM Fixed Income, and prior to that, he held a number of other distinguished positions at the Treasury Department and also at Goldman Sachs. Peter has been leading this work for us in the American Statecraft program with a number of excellent papers and other publications on economic statecraft. He's a non-resident fellow here at Carnegie and himself served as the Senior Director for International Economics in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. Delighted to have you both, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that introduction, and thanks for all of you for coming out in person this afternoon to hear from Daleep on a topic that I know has been of a great deal of interest both here in Washington and in a number of capitals around the world. But I should begin by saying it is such a pleasure, Daleep, to welcome you here to Carnegie. Daleep and I have had the pleasure of working together off and on since I want to say at least like 2013, 2014, when Daleep was at the Treasury Department and I was at the State Department. We kind of got to know each other the first time around through Russia sanctions, and we worked together second time around on Russia sanctions. Really too much time on Russia sanctions over the years. There's another collaborator of ours from the White House, Eric Green, who did a lot of Russia sanctions. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about, in many ways, some of the positive side of the agenda and things we are doing here in the United States and working with allies and partners to build an economy that works for all of us, to help promote a transition to a green economy, and sort of how do we get our allies and partners engaged in U.S. industrial policy and work with allies and partners on key industrial policy challenges. And I actually just want to begin by opening with a question, a sort of big picture question about what we're trying to achieve with industrial policy, because it seems to me this is a topic that from an American perspective, we might have talked about the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and fell out of favor, came back into favor over the last couple of years in a serious way. And I think that in foreign policy circles, like many of the people around in this room, there is an assumption that we just take for granted that industrial policy is first and foremost about China. We're trying to make sure that we are not dependent on China for key supply chains, and we're trying to make sure that we are able to compete with China effectively in an era of geopolitical competition. But having worked with you at the White House, and I think talking to folks on the economic side of the ledger, you hear other theories about what our industrial policy is about. So I think before getting into how allies and partners can be a piece of this and how we should work together, I'd like to just sort of open it with a question of, what do you think is behind the pivot to industrial policy we've seen over the last couple of years? And what do you think, how do you think about prioritizing or deciding what sectors and we should be focusing on?
Well, first, Peter, it's a real pleasure to see you. Everything we've done in this administration that has anything to do with international economic policy has your fingerprints all over it. And we were in the trenches together from day one. And good to see friends in the audience, too. Okay, so why industrial policy? If you ask me, it's more than just, it's not just about China. You know, I think there are, the simplest way for me to explain it is that the private sector is not designed to confront many of the greatest challenges we face to economic and national security. And these are all challenges that we know about. They were laid bare during the pandemic, but I would say they were growing for the past several decades of hyperglobalization. You were instrumental in the work to help restore resilience in our critical supply chains that had been losing their resilience because of a singular pursuit of maximal efficiency, minimal cost. We've seen a fading of our technological preeminence, in part due to the drying up of public funding for R&D. We've seen a hollowing out of our industrial base. We have a compounding climate crisis. We have high and rising inequality. I mean, I would just say so many of these challenges are symptomatic of a post-Cold War model of political economy that rested on two flawed assumptions: that markets left entirely to themselves have all the answers, and that it's the end of history for geopolitical competition. Both of those assumptions are wrong. So industrial policy is based on the premise that these market failures exist, that we can identify them, and that government can at least partially correct some of these failures with very targeted interventions. And they come in many different forms. It can be tax incentives, it could be procurement, could be investment subsidies, could be immigration reform, could be education policy, could be trade measures, competition policy. But I think the common thread across all of those policy interventions is that they're trying to change the composition, the structure of economic activity in a way that's better aligned with national interest. And you mentioned the 1950s and 60s, but I think this goes all the way back to the beginning. Not just the beginning of our country, the beginning of capitalism. Adam Smith wrote about this, about industrial policy. Obviously, Hamilton did too. And then Lincoln, Roosevelt, we all know about the post-Sputnik era. Somebody mentioned to me the other day, we accounted for 70%, the US government accounted for 70% of global R&D in the post-World War II era, more than every other country and company combined at that time. And you know, I mean, it's been often observed, every significant innovation in the digital age was in some ways the product of collaboration between government, business, and academia. You know, semiconductors, satellites, graphical user interfaces, smartphones, the internet. And so that's really, that's the history of industrial policy in this country. It's been the norm rather than the exception. And I mean, you didn't ask the question, but I would say if I put on my macroeconomist hat on, it's worked pretty darn well. I mean, it's the only way I know how to explain how we've had sustained above trend growth, with the exception of early 2022, and very rapid disinflation. It's something stirring on the supply side of the economy. And you see it in the data. I mean, the unemployment rate was below 4% for the longest stretch in 50 years. We've had wages rising faster than prices since last May. Wage inequality is compressing. Household wealth's at a record level. And I mean, I know there's some gloomy sentiment indicators out there, but just look at what people are doing. Consumers are spending, businesses are hiring, they're investing, startups are booming. I think this is the strongest foundation for our economy since the mid to late 1990s. And so the challenge is, how do we keep it going?
Well, let me ask actually a follow-up on that, because you talked about some of the positive indicators in the data, and you also talked some about, you know, innovation and sort of historical role of federal R&D and innovation. How do you think about the goals that the Biden administration has for industrial policy? I think one that comes up a lot is green transition, right? We probably all agree on that. Obviously, reducing dependence on China. But how do you, are sort of compressing income inequality and supporting middle class wage growth. Like, how do you think about the sort of top 3 or 4 objectives? So we think about these different industrial policy measures.
The way I look at it is, our job within the White House, yours and mine, was to think about challenges at the intersection of economic policy and national security. So let me give you an answer that is really looking at industrial policy through a strategic frame. I mean, I think it's now commonly accepted that we're living through the most intense period of great power competition in at least 70 years. So for me, the right way to think about industrial policy, the right strategic frame, is to consider it as multiplayer, multi-stage game theory. And that really lends itself to an analysis of how can we develop and reinforce asymmetric advantages where our strengths intersect with a rival's vulnerabilities. But it also means, and that's everything to do with trying to sustain our technological preeminence in areas like AI and semiconductors and quantum that harness our capacity to innovate. But it's also, I think this is less appreciated, about neutralizing our asymmetric weaknesses, where our vulnerabilities intersect with a rival's strengths. For example, there are many supply chains in which China has acquired a dominant market position in a strategic sector in which we have very limited production capacity. So, I mean, certainly we want to pick sectors in which we can reinforce asymmetric advantage, but we also want to blunt, and here I would credit, Rush Doshi for kind of thinking of this frame. You want to blunt areas in which we have an asymmetric disadvantage. And shipbuilding is I think, a recent example of a sector we've picked that has strategic significance and for which we really need to revitalize our industrial capacity using alliances and partnerships. We are now, if you'll just indulge me with some of the numbers, because I think it's illustrative. I think we now represent 0.2% of the global order book for commercial ships. So we're 19th. We used to be number 1 in 1975. China is now 50% of the total. All of its commercial ships can be retrofitted for wartime. And it's a strategic challenge for us because, of course, without a commercial shipbuilding presence, it's very difficult to ensure the global flow of goods, to defend freedom of navigation, and 90% of our military equipment and fuel arrives by sea. So what do you do about that? Do you replicate China's strategy, which is to use massive subsidies that market forces would never sustain in a highly commoditized business that's at the mercy of freight rights? Probably not. But we can pick a niche of shipbuilding, like polar icebreakers, that's highly complex, highly specialized, and could draw upon the expertise of allies. And enter Finland, a newly minted NATO ally and the world's leading designer of polar icebreakers. We've only built 2 of them in the past 50 years. They're both past their usable service life. And if we want to project power in the Arctic region, which is melting, and therefore creating more shipping lanes and exposing a wealth of critical minerals under the sea, and also exposed at our northern flank to Russia and China's encroachment, we need to grow our production capacity. So the deal that was announced on the sidelines of NATO was Finland and Canada, which just bought the Helsinki shipyard after the 2 previous owners, Russian oligarchs, were sanctioned, will invest in our shipyard, share their expertise, will make our supply chains interoperable, and will build a suppliers club and compete for the 70 to 90 polar icebreakers that we think allies and partners want to build over the next decade. If we can pull this off, it's an example of how industrial policy in a low-tech sector can grow our industrial base, number 1, to safeguard our national security in an important region of the world, number 2, and strengthen our alliances and partnerships. And we can replicate that. I mean, there are a number of sectors that have the same features in which we have an asymmetric disadvantage. China has a dominant position. We have limited production capacity. But through the power of our alliances, a key asymmetric strength, we can at least neutralize that disadvantage.
Yeah, no, and I think that the announcement around the NATO summit about this kind of icebreaker pact is a really interesting example of how allies and partners can get involved. And that kind of brings me to the next question I wanted to put to you, which is, so you talk about the Polar Icebreaker Pact, which involves Canada, involves Finland, clearly an example of allied cooperation. I think all of us who lived through, particularly the first year or so after the Inflation Reduction Act passed, however, saw another side of this where some of our allies and partners were less than enthusiastic about some of the industrial policy measures that the U.S. had taken, and we're raising some real questions about whether our industrial policy is a fundamentally protectionist, in some of these key sectors is fundamentally a protectionist frame, or whether it is whether there are genuine opportunities to work collaboratively on this. And I'd welcome a little bit of an elaboration about how you respond to that criticism, how you are seeing potential to work with allies and partners more collaboratively on some of the IRA sectors as well as on shipbreakers, and kind of what the overall message to allies and partners about U.S. industrial policy has been.
Well, you took the incoming along with Mike after IRA, but I wod say 5 things maybe. Number one, we've had the benefit of time and therefore we have data. And the data clearly show this has not been a zero sum. The outcome of the IRA has not been zero sum. If you look at the FDI data, inbound FDI into Europe, it's risen dramatically since the IRA was passed. And a non-trivial portion of that is bilateral FDI from the US. If you look at outbound FDI from Europe to other parts of the world, including the US, it remains very high. That's because Europe is a current account surplus region, but it has not been rising. The second point I would make is that the output of the IRA has been a massive global public good. We're producing much more clean energy, and we're reducing the cost of clean energy. I think we're now tracking for a 40% reduction in our emissions by the end of this decade relative to 2005 levels. And as we increase our productive scale in clean energy, we are increasing unit cost efficiency and crowding in the private sector. These are all very sizable global public goods that spill over across our borders. The third thing is we're nowhere near the saturation point for productive investment in clean energy. Nowhere near. I think the IMF's numbers are that we had $900 billion of clean energy investments globally in 2020. We need that to be $5 trillion annually by 2030, all the way to 2050 to hit our global net zero targets. So we're nowhere near crowding out clean energy investments anywhere else in the world by virtue of the IRA. The fourth thing is let's be real about this. If you want the clean energy transition to be sustainable, it must pass political muster. Climate change, it's a global problem. It's going to have national solutions. And so we have to pay attention to whether our domestic strategy is a net contributor to jobs, wages, investment, growth, and productivity. And every country is going to have to go through its own process for reaching that conclusion. And the last, I suppose if there's a final point, it's that our overarching strategy is ultimately a positive sum vision. The way I describe it to counterparts and friends in Europe is, number one, we want to center our industrial policy on increasing our productive capacity, R&D, infrastructure, technology, size and skills of our labor force. We want the same thing to happen in allied countries. Number two, we want to give access to our productive capacity, our purchasing power, to countries playing by the same rules and vice versa. And number three, we're going to regrettably need to use tariffs and restrictive measures to level the playing field with the countries that are playing by a very different set of rules, both to sustain the financial viability of our investments and to prevent ongoing harm to our economic strategy, our national security, our political economy. I think that's a positive vision that allies are increasingly buying into.
It's interesting to hear you say that, and I will say, after the initial incoming around the IRA, I do think we saw, at least among some of our G7 partners, a pivot towards thinking about some of their own parallel kind of measures. Right in Europe now we have the Green Deal, and sort of recognition that there might be some opportunities to work together. I also think we saw, just in a very tangible sort of commercial sense, if you look at the companies that have been benefiting from IRA incentives, many of them are not American, right? We've seen huge investments by South Korean and Japanese and European firms here in the United States. There's obviously another non-G7 part of the world. There's a number of large developing countries that I think look at what we're doing on industrial policy and have kind of a question of, hey, traditionally one of our paths to prosperity was to build a bunch of stuff here, right, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and in Brazil, that sort of thing, and then sell it to high-income countries in sort of a traditional free trade sort of regime. And I think you get questions, at least when I've been talking to policymakers from a number of the key emerging markets, about where this leaves them, and is there really an opportunity for the emerging market, either via contributing to our industrialization efforts here or by finding some financing from us to industrialize themselves? Where do you see the role of some of these big emerging market players in U.S. industrial policy?
So I think the main message to developing countries is that they deserve the same opportunities that we've had to pursue an investment and productivity-led growth strategy. Of course, the problem with saying that to the developing world is they don't have fiscal space. And they don't have fiscal space due to a succession of shocks that were no fault of their own. COVID, the spike in food and energy prices after Russia invaded Ukraine, climate change, tight global financial conditions, all of these shocks have drained public resources and severely limited the capacity to make the kind of growth-enhancing investments that we're pursuing here in the US. And that leads directly to a conversation around debt. And the numbers are really stark. The median low-income country is now spending almost 15% of its tax revenues on external debt service. Most low-income countries are now spending more on external debt service than they are in the aggregate on education, healthcare, and social spending. And the number of countries that are experiencing net external credit outflows has doubled over the past decade. So, we're going to have a G20 in November, and one of our priorities is to try to sketch out a grand bargain. We have a collective action problem. We all know why. And the only way to solve the collective action problem is to change the incentives that exist in the international debt architecture. So in our mind, it should involve at least 4 steps. Number one, the IMF should work with developing countries and really shape ambitious investment-led growth agendas that actually are reflected in a different debt sustainability, a DSA methodology, debt sustainability analysis methodology, so that more countries are given credit for growth-enhancing investments, productivity-enhancing initiatives, and suffer less from the kind of recipe that's been around for a long time, that if you cut spending and raise taxes, that's the way to relieve your debt burden. Number two, and this is the really important part, if we need to have G7 leaders commit to sustain net positive financial flows to developing countries over a lengthy period. That can come in a lot of different forms. They can be debt service suspensions, debt reprofiling, new forms of budget support. They can be economically equivalent. The third step would be, again, for the IMF to enforce these kinds of financing pledges by more aggressively using its lending into official arrears policy, which to date has been really quite meek. And then lastly, we've got to get more creative about how to crowd in the private sector with incentives, with credit enhancements, with guarantees that would make debt swaps possible, exchanges possible, without being downgraded by credit rating agencies. I think that has the makings of a different kind of architecture that gives developing countries a chance to use the kind of policy space that we have. Then after we've gotten to a better steady state, we'll be in a position to have conversations about how to more deeply integrate our supply chains.
Well, that brings me to another question. You brought up a number of the challenges on financing that the developing world had, which is about the toolkit for an allied industrial policy. Obviously, on some things like polar icebreakers, you have kind of a diplomatic toolkit and maybe a bit of a commercial toolkit. For some of our own supply chain resilience, we've seen use of tax incentives sort of toolkit. I will say from where I sat when I was a policymaker and looking at it since, I certainly saw some weaknesses in some of the more international-facing toolkit that we have. I mean, everybody, I think, in the U.S. government loves the DFC and would like the DFC to do more. I think those of us tried to get the DFC to do more, so all kinds of challenges, no fault of the DFC, but kind of some of the way in which they are structured, getting them to do more. I think, similarly, one think about financing tools for Global South, sovereign loan guarantees, something that's been challenging to execute over time. I'm curious where you see weaknesses in the toolkit. And for a sort of successful allied industrial policy, not just sort of over a 3-month period, but over a couple of years, where do you think we need to be thinking of ways to strengthen that toolkit?
I mean, I share the premise of your question. We're in this intense period of geopolitical competition. I think the competition is going to play out mostly in the theater of economics and technology, and we just simply don't have the financial firepower to compete with many of our strategic rivals. And it's very easy for us to use the kind of measures of statecraft that break linkages in the global economy. And you and I were practitioners in the use of sanctions and export controls and tariffs and price caps and the like. It's much harder. You have to be much more creative to find ways in a fiscally constrained environment to get much more bang for the buck with our affirmative tools. And so, I don't think that, I think we've got to go through a real exercise of sharpening our existing tools, inventing new ones, and thinking really hard about how to use those tools in collaboration with allies and partners. You mentioned a couple of them, but let me just say generically, we need a flexible, patient form of capital deployment that can invest where the private sector will not. And the private sector tends not to invest in areas that could plausibly advance our strategic objectives in supply chains or technology or energy security when the time horizon to recoup the investment and earn a commercial return is very, very long, or where it requires a really enormous amount of risk appetite because the uncertainties are very high or the complexity is large, or where there's just an information asymmetry. The government has a lot of information, but the private sector does not, and there's a lot of coordination involved. I don't think we can, our true competitive advantage in this country is always going to be the private sector. We want to catalyze them, but there'll be many areas in which they're not going to be the first mover. And then if you believe those gaps exist, the question is, do our existing public authorities, are they sufficiently flexible? Are they adequate to deploy at pace and with scale to fill those gaps? And I don't think so. I mean, like the DFC you mentioned, it has a development mandate. It's meant to invest in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. There are many investments that are worth making in middle and high-income countries that advance the strategic objectives that I mentioned. There are other authorities, for example, within DoD that have a strictly defense-oriented mandate, or that have a very short time horizon, or just a very limited top-line budget. And so, we do need some type of tool that could plausibly help us fill that gap with all the appropriate guardrails and, sustainable sources of financing. Those are challenging questions. But there's some tools that already exist. I mean, sovereign loan guarantees, I think for middle-income countries that have a reasonably, let's say, an investment-grade credit rating or close to an investment-grade credit rating, if we offer sovereign loan guarantees to those countries, that's really our only concessional lending instrument we can bring to bear. That can slash the borrowing cost of those recipients by hundreds of basis points. It's often very cost-effective for the taxpayer because the risk of default is low. But we've only issued 6 of them in the past 30 years. We I think, should ask questions around whether we should reimagine the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was created in the 1970s when we were net petroleum importers. Now we're a net exporter, but we have a lot of critical minerals and refined products we need to import. Can we expand? Should we expand the authority? So these are all just examples of tools that can give us more financial firepower. I think those are necessary to give some of the alliances and partnerships we've formed more credibility. I'm thinking of PGI in particular. For it to truly make an impact the world over, it's going to need more flexible, patient financial firepower. And I hope if we have the opportunity over the next few years, to really make this the kind of the animating purpose of what international economic policy is focused on.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that, Daleep. You've talked quite extensively about the need for both some financial tools here, but driven in part because you see financing as a major part of the challenge here. But obviously there's also a trade part of this. And if I look at the last couple of years, when I think about from where I sit as an allied industrial policy, one of the sets of tools that has been out there that's been discussed to some degree between the US and allies is a limited trade toolkit, right? So we've talked a little about critical minerals agreements with a couple of allies. It's an idea that's been out there. I know the State Department has this mineral security partnership. And there's some other ideas out there that are more in the trade space. Where do you see trade tools fitting in an allied industrial policy?
Well, I think actually my thoughts are similar to yours, the ones you've at least written down, which is, and it goes back to what I said previously, is if we're in an environment in which we're, to varying degrees, practicing industrial policy again, that of course starts with trying to increase our productive capacity at home. But we really should, the second part is where trade comes in. We really should have economic partnerships in which we're giving access to our productive capacity and our purchasing power to countries that are playing by the same rules in a particular sector. And then the third piece is we will need to use collective restrictive measures to level the playing field with countries that are not playing by the same rules. So you can think of sectoral trade agreements in critical minerals, in certain technologies that have different groupings in which we share the same standards, we want to compete by the same rules. And they'll have different, it's not going to be a country-wide type of trade arrangement, but it will harmonize the way in which we practice subsidies, the way that we put in place tax measures, our emissions standards, et cetera, labor standards. That I think has a chance, more of a bottom-up approach of adding up to much more significant connective tissue between us and countries that have similar ambition. But we've got to actually just start picking 2 or 3 industries and test it out.
That's fair. And the other side, we'll have the other negotiating partners will have a view on that. Well, that's the end of the questions I wanted to ask you. I do want to take an opportunity to open up to some audience questions. And if you're watching this online, you can submit a question online. And those are showing up on the iPad here, which is why I've been making sure the iPad stays live. And if you're in the room, you can also submit one online, or we'll come around and I'll just old-fashioned ask people to ask some questions. We have gotten a couple of questions that have come in here. And the first I actually want to pose to you, which is a short one, and it's from Anjali Bhatt over at Peterson Institute, which is, we talk a lot as part of our industrial policy about this concept of economic security. And this isn't a concept just here. We certainly talk about economic security here in Washington, but Japanese talk about economic security. We're increasingly hearing it out of Brussels and elsewhere. And she asks, can you define economic security in one sentence? I might say succinctly. Let's not try one sentence. Succinctly. And what would what does a gain or win for economic security look like?
What does a win look like?
Yeah, for economic security.
I think of economic security as being the ability to sustain the sources of long-term economic growth potential across cycles. And a win is...
That's one sentence. I give you credit for that.
I could say more.
That's a succinct one. That's great.
So what's a win? It is when we can have sufficient confidence that the definition of economic security I just described is resilient and robust to a world of intensified geopolitical competition.
Great. The next question is coming in, well, it's actually by Doug, who's here in the room, Doug Reaker. So Doug, I'm going to ask you to, go ahead and just stand up and ask the question. I'll repeat it online so that people can hear it. Oh, there's a mic. We can actually get you a mic, and then the folks online can hear it.
This is why I wrote it in the. So this was a little bit before you went into some of the things that you went to when I submitted the question. But last week, China hosted 50 African leaders and pledged, amongst other things, $50 billion of new support, as well as a number of other measures, including zero tariffs on on LDCs and a bunch of other measures. That's a pretty big continent, and that's a pretty big commitment, and it's a pretty big show of force. How does the White House, how does the U.S. take on that kind of a financial and political commitment?
I would say, Doug, I would put back to China, are you willing, therefore, to sustain net positive financial flows to developing countries? Because those numbers you mentioned are large, but so are the outflows. So are the repayments to Belt Road Initiative loans and other forms of financing. And on a net basis, China is withdrawing money. So we have to look at both sides of the equation. If they're willing to sustain net positive financial flows, we should applaud.
So we're okay if they roll over and increase their exposure? Because certainly there are those who would argue that we want China to have less exposure and less influence in these countries. And so it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
I don't think we should be defensive about it. I think we have a better product. I think developing countries want to have a choice. They would like to be able to choose between the type of financing they've received from Beijing, which in some cases has been a net positive, but in other cases has been a disaster, either because of the environmental impact, the labor consequences, the financial sustainability issues, or all of the above. And we should offer a positive alternative, and so should G7 countries, that create the same kind of race to the top that we're talking about in clean energy and lots of other sectors. That's what we owe the developing world. And we shouldn't ask China to take its ball and go home. We should enter the competition.
Next question is from Michael Nelson here, and it's actually to both of us, but I'm going to make you answer first so I can think about it. Which is, much of the debate over industrial policy, especially related to digital technologies, is shaped by simplistic, misleading metaphors and memes like data is the new oil or a tech Cold War. A question for both of us: what's a misperception that you'd like to remove from the brains of every member of Congress and journalist and citizen who's thinking about industrial policy?
Oh, that it's picking winners and losers. That's my least favorite caricature of what we're talking about. Because, look, that's one form of industrial policy. That is not the form of industrial policy that we're practicing. And I was trying to mention a few different ways in which industrial policy takes shape. We're trying to, if you want to think about it in purely economic terms, we're trying to improve the factor inputs. We're trying to improve the competitive conditions. We're trying to recognize that scale economies matter, that learning effects are real, that ecosystems can have an impact not only on your ability to produce and build, but also research, design, and development. And so I think instead of caricaturing what industrial policy is, it would be better if we actually learn from history of what forms, what types have the best chance of working in today's context. That would improve the quality of the discourse. But Peter, I'd be curious.
I actually was going to pick up on a theme you spoke to, Daleep, earlier in the session. I think there's often a misperception that industrial policy is only about kind of a set of financial incentives, whether it's tax credits or grants. And I actually think for an effective industrial policy, it is, as you began to talk about earlier, a broader toolkit that not only includes obviously sort of like R&D things, but also, for example, includes immigration issues, right? If we're going to actually succeed in our CHIPS Act goals of having not just manufacturing of current generation, including current leading edge generation semiconductors here in the US, but to maintain an edge in semiconductor technologies going forward, probably immigration's got to be a piece of that, right? It's about getting engineers from around the world to come here to the US to start companies here. And so I think we need to get beyond this idea that it's just industrial policy is just 15% government cost share for something that we want to build. That's an important piece of it, but you got to integrate a broader toolkit.
Can I just add one other comment that kind of irks me at times, is that countries, the comparative advantage of a country is something that is just sort of endowed by some divine right. It's just bequeathed to us. But in fact, I mean, I believe that it's in part the consequence of policy choices. You know, there is path dependency. What we're good at producing, what we're efficient at producing tomorrow has some relationship to what we're good at producing today and what we were producing efficiently yesterday because of learning effects, because of scale economies. And again, to repeat, I think ecosystems really do matter. There's a reason why clusters exist. They don't exist by accident. And there is a relationship, I think, between your ability to make and produce and build and your capacity to innovate. And that often gets lost in the discussion.
I want to pause. Questions in the room? Yes, let me come over here.
Thank you, Stuart Patrick, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My question is, what changes, if any, would you like to see at the WTO for the new era of industrial policy? Does the global trading regime need to change to accommodate some of these practices that were often frowned upon in previous decades? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the most tangible step that WTO could take would be to help us measure and assess the use of subsidies. You know, we've had this discussion for the past couple of years now about Chinese overcapacity. We'd all really benefit if there was a third-party arbiter of what overcapacity means. What are the metrics? I mean, I think there are a number of metrics you could point to. Volume-based metrics, China's domestic production trajectory relative to the global demand trajectory. Is there an imbalance? What's their capacity utilization? How is it moving over time? You could look at financial variables. Are your leading exporters losing money consistently over time? You can look at nominal variables. Are you persistently in deflation? You could look at market structure, et cetera, and then look at other countries, compare how they're moving across time and across countries, and then we can have a discussion about whether in equilibrium, you know, this is going to be a competitive dynamic that's sustainable. I think that's the kind of work that's been missing, quite frankly. It's been a very narrow. The function of the WTO has been narrowed to dispute settlement, and it's been at the cost of the monitoring function. And that's a big problem for us.
What I like about that answer is you gave a positive sort of thing that the WTO could focus on usefully going forward, whereas I do feel like so much of the debate here about the WTO is more negative of how does, and I think that's an important debate to have, Minister. I look at this issue and I think we should be thinking about, is there, is it time to talk about, a green ceasefire at the WTO and create some additional policy space, at least among kind of the industrialized Western members of the WTO, and maybe we sort of have achieved that with the IRA. I mean, we persuaded all of our allies not to challenge the IRA at the WTO, but I like that you have sort of an affirmative, here's actually something positive the WTO could go out and do to help us with our industrial policy. So thank you for that. No, I want to come over here.
Hi, Noah Gordon from the Carnegie Endowment. Thanks for being here. You mentioned prioritization of supply chains, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that within clean energy technologies. Do you think the U.S. policy sufficiently distinguishes between, say, solar and batteries in terms of where we want the U.S. to land on what you've called the continuum between resilience and dominance?
Yeah, I think that's work that lies ahead. In my view, we have to look at every critical supply chain, clean energy being perhaps first among equals, and map out globally where are our vulnerabilities, where are the likely choke points, where might we actually have dominance, and make sure it all hangs together. There may be, you mentioned the solar supply chain, there may be stages of production in the solar supply chain, like ingots and wafers, for which we're not likely to have production capacity anytime soon, but we have to have a minimally viable amount of supply in order for the downstream competitors in our country or in allied countries to continue to produce output. And we don't need to have dominance at every stage of production, but we have to be really attentive to choke points. If we can't really relieve them domestically, that's where the conversation with allies and partners comes in. We have obviously large vulnerabilities right now, both at the extraction level of production and most importantly, processing. So what are the minerals that we need to reach our climate objectives? Where do they exist? Can they bridge the shortfall in 5 years' time and 10 years' time? And do the countries from which we could import them meet our standards? That should sort of set the table for how we prioritize potential sectoral trade agreements.
I'm going to ask a question that came in from Advait Arun at the Center for Public Enterprise. I've actually changed the question just a little bit. The question is, I'm curious about the status of the Indo-Pacific Economic Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. It fits your idea for a limited standard-setting partnership in a few key supply chain sectors. And then says, but there hasn't been a lot of public administration news about it in some time. I subscribe to the Commerce Department press releases, so maybe I get the news more directly. I know there have been some meetings just in the last month or two with IPEF, but I think it is more broadly a fair question in the sense of we have IPEF across the Indo-Pacific. There's a supply chain chapter for it. There's a clean energy chapter for it. Where do you see IPEF fitting in kind of an allied approach to industrial policy?
Oh, it's all, I mean, it's one of several examples of alliances and partnerships for which we need to actually have an expanded toolkit to create the incentives for countries in the Indo-Pacific, for example, to buy in further. And you've had, I think, some really creative ideas, Peter, about how we could induce more countries to sign up to more chapters of IPEF in ways that I think are worthy of further exploration. Can we create a CFIUS whitelist, for example? Can we create a regime in which sanctions would not be placed on a country without prior consultation? Should we think about 30D subsidies being part of the conversation as well? Could we use DPA Title III? Could we use new tools that I was describing earlier? I think that's what's needed for IPEF, APEP, lots of other economic partnerships that we could conceive of to really have life and credibility over the course of several political cycles. That's what's missing.
Other questions in the room? Let me come here. And I know we're probably going to just have time for one, maybe two more, because I know we need to get you out the door a minute or two before 5. So we will honor that too. But let me come over here.
Thank you very much for the very insightful discussion. Martin Vladimir from European Public Policy Institute, CSD. My question is on shifting to kind of Russia and sanctions a little bit. Russia has tried to maintain its position on global economic and financial markets, and it seems to be successful, or relatively successful, to the amount of pressure and sanctions that have been imposed. So what are the tools that are missing to complete the strategic decoupling from Russia, especially in the West? The West still buys a lot of oil and gas and still enables a lot of the kind of budget flows to the Kremlin. So what is missing? And also, how can we incentivize other countries also outside of the G7 to impose tougher measures on Russia? Can we kind of match economic footprint with footprint, so kind of give an alternative to these countries?
Yeah, I think it involves two different lines of effort: disarming the Russian war machine and defunding it, and sanctions and export controls are our tools. Disarming the Russian war machine really is all about changing the incentives of third countries that have been producing components that end up directly in the battlefield to Russia's advantage, or transshipment. And China is the most egregious violator of our sanctions regime in that respect, but India, Turkey, UAE, other countries as well. In terms of defunding the war machine, this is all about energy. And I think we're getting closer to the point at which we can talk about a much more strict regime, both in terms of the shadow fleet, but also the amount of oil that Russia is allowed to supply to the market. Those are the two lines of effort that are needed. I would say we have to intensify in order to achieve our objectives.
Let me just add one point to that, because I think that clearly in a short-term scenario, short term, call it 6 months to 3 years, if we are going to reduce Russia's oil revenues, it's going to be through use of sanctions tools, other tools to go after their current hydrocarbon exports. I think if you look over a longer term time horizon, and I fear, well, I am optimistic, hopeful we will get a positive resolution on the current war. I think Russia is going to remain deeply adversarial for a longer term time horizon. Over a longer term time horizon, clearly every industrial policy we take that reduces global demand for some of those hydrocarbons creates space for us to put more pressure on Russia's export of them, right? I mean, one of the challenges we faced over the last couple of years in a relatively high energy price environment has been, a trade-off between wanting to put pressure on Russia's revenues from hydrocarbons, but also not wanting to see global energy prices go through the roof. The more we can take demand offline through some clean energy measures, including clean energy industrial policy, that's a great policy space to try to disproportionately take Russian oil off the market. I think we have time for probably one more question here in the room, and let me come to you, sir.
Thank you for taking questions. My name is Ken Scabier from Marubeni Corporation, a Japanese private company. So with today's discussion and your comment on economic security and industrial policy, I just wonder if what kind of the assessment, a risk assessment, or the strategy behind the deal between the Nippon Steel and the U.S. Steel. I know you might be able to talk about the specific deal, but could you give me some comment on the foreign investment from Japan or foreign investment on the U.S. steel industry? Thank you.
Yeah, and I apologize, I can't comment on the deal specifically, but with respect to foreign investment and from Japan in particular, it must remain the lifeblood of our economy. Any retreat from that type of strategy would be self-defeating for us.
I'll just add one final comment on that, being non-government, but looking at this, and looking at what the U.S. government has done, and obviously there's a lot of debate right now about U.S. Steel, and I have no insight, and obviously Daleep can't talk about it. But I look back to just earlier this year when the Biden administration found some bipartisan infrastructure law money, which they managed to award as a grant to a subsidiary of Mitsui, another Japanese company, to help build cranes for ports here in the United States. Getting direct incentive, not just allowing the investment, but giving direct incentive in order to do it. And obviously, like CFIUS looks at cases come by, but I think just actually the kind of documented experience over the last couple of years out of the Biden-Harris administration, out of the U.S. government, has been very welcoming to Japanese investment and to other allied country investment here in the U.S. And I worry sometimes because we have such a debate over Nippon Steel, it colors the narrative disproportionate to what it should, because the overwhelming evidence has been a welcoming approach to Japanese investment in the U.S. Let me say, I know you have to run. Thank you very much for this. And thanks to all of you for the questions and for the time this afternoon. And Daleep, thank you for everything you are doing on behalf of the country.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks very much.
Thank you. You bet.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah.
I'll walk you out this way.